Snow. It's been there since the dawn of accelerated 3D on PC, and developers keep attempting to render the white stuff to their best all these years later. In today's retro-inspired video brought to you by NVIDIA, Inno3D, and Overclockers UK, I will take you through the history of snow rendering on PC, slaloming through the earliest days of Direct3D on period-correct hardware, showcasing milestone releases and techniques with their real and sometimes rather stormy performance. When going through each era on each PC configuration, we will track the evolution of snow rendering from its infancy to the state-of-the-art we enjoy today in modern games. To showcase those modern games, I will be playing them on an icy white PC by Overclockers UK, sporting an Inno3D RTX 5070 and a Ryzen 9 series processor, both of which will be thematically chilled to perfection in a snow-white Haven 940 case with a Lian HydroShift AIO, a wintry PC fit for the season. But before I get into the games running on this PC, let's go back to PCs of winters past. In the mid-90s, getting snow to look right and be performant was a true challenge on hardware of the time. Consumers could render games on their CPUs and all the limitations that entails, or they had access to inflexible yet faster 3D accelerators like the Riva 128 we see here. Even though graphics accelerators handedly beat CPUs of the day at standard polygon rendering, they were nonetheless limited. They could still only push so many polygons and textures at a time while maintaining reasonable frame rates, and most manufacturers were still on first-generation architectures that were balancing basic features like 2D acceleration in Windows with 3D speed and affordability. So in spite of the hardware acceleration, devs were still, of course, very limited in their 3D performance budget. They could only spare so many textures and polygons to hit 30 FPS and above. Yet in spite of this, snow was found in abundance right at the beginning. Take 1997's Star Wars: Shadows of the Empire. This is one of the first games I think of when I think of hardware-accelerated snow in 3D. This DirectX 5 powered version of Hoth renders snow in a way that is extremely typical of the era. Single textures that vary colors between white and blue that are stretched across surfaces with minimal shading, if any at all. You can find some bilinear texture filtering there, keeping chunky pixels out of sight. To increase the wintry look, you can occasionally see some bluish hardware-accelerated fog in the distance, which many games at this time use to increase the atmospheric feeling, but also save on performance as stuff beyond the fog just wouldn't be rendered. Geometry processing power was so scarce that games from this era typically just have flat surfaces for snow, with little variation in height and depth to show how snow or ice will build up on itself. At best, you'll see a variety of snow textures that had different striations on them, or darker blues to delineate snow from ice. And that was really it. And that just goes to show how simpler times were when graphics accelerators could only do so much. And even with these visual limitations, they were still challenging to run. A Pentium 2 233 paired with a Riva 128 under Windows 95 is just barely holding on to 30 FPS by the skin of its teeth, sometimes teetering below when the scene gets too complex or some explosion shows up. This struggle to make games performant and have suitably realistic or dense snow in larger scenes remained much the case up until the early 2000s. If you go from this game in 1997 to, say, Soldier of Fortune from 2000, I don't think much has changed between these two titles and how snow is rendered. You still have singular snow textures and fog at a distance. Hardware could run with a few more polygons in 2000, of course, like we see here, and at a higher frame rate, but I would still say that the snow is visually blocky and almost abstract looking. Basically, what I want to show here is that the same techniques for rendering snow existed over a long time period up until the early days of pixel shading. They were just essentially running better on later hardware. In spite of this stagnation, you could say, in the period, due to the hardware's limitations, there were some neat effects that devs would do with the power at hand. Take a game like Croc. Its cutesy, winter-themed levels are built much like those we see in Shadows of the Empire, just with textures that are more cartoony. Yet they have a neat effect here if you look. Croc would sometimes render some geometry semi-transparent, like these blue blocks here, giving them the appearance of ice as you can see through to the other side. Or you have a game like Wipeout 2097. Its snow level has tiny little 2D billboard particles in the air, which are supposed to be falling and look like snow. When you race forward, these are then replaced by textures that have been drawn to look like horizontal white lines. This kind of makes the snowflakes look like they are whipping past your racer at great speed. I would say some of the highest heights of this early 3D Accelerator era can be found in a game from late 1999 or early 2000 like Sega Rally 2 or Supreme Snowboarding from Housemarque. Sega Rally 2 is a DX6 game, while Supreme Snowboarding scales up to DX7 and the first GPUs, and both required a lot of horsepower to run well. Sega Rally combines distance fog, falling particulate snow, and snowy terrain that is much more complex than previous titles, pushing far more polygons with rounded and varying height snow on the banks versus the track, and this was surprisingly rare. Supreme Snowboarding is much the same, but perhaps with even more rounded snowy terrain, being a snowboarding game after all. It is utilizing its DX7 geometry pushing power to the fullest and absolutely lays waste to my GeForce 256 SDR at 800 by 600, running quite poorly, I would say. In both games, accelerating through the snow leaves marks in your wake. Car tracks in Sega Rally and a snowboard indentation in Supreme Snowboarding. Both also have this really cool effect where semi-transparent ribbons of geometry appear behind your car or character when a turn or fall is particularly harsh. Supreme Snowboarding also shades the snow better than most games, I would say, with light maps and per vertex lighting that gives the night stage a real extreme sports feeling. Yes, that vertex lighting does make the seams between geometry more visible, but at lower resolutions, I don't think you'd be bothered by it. For me, both of these games represent the apex of snow rendering on PC in the era before pixel shading. And even with them being the highest end you could really muster, I think the limitations are obvious. Looking through all these games from 96 to 2000, I think we can see how great a struggle it was to represent snow in a way that looks natural. Developers had few tools to work with that were just limited. Single texture surfaces maybe with one blend layer, a bit of transparency here or there for falling snow or ice, fog at a distance, and geometry of which they really couldn't use a lot of, otherwise it would tank performance, kind of like we see in Supreme Snowboarding. Just the basic notion of having ground of varying height was expensive to render at this time, so snow-covered ground was often almost nearly always flat, with detail being filled in with 2D textures. It almost goes without saying, but snow in real life of course has tons of undulations, rounded areas that have been softened by winds, sharp corners and little facets, and even more variation on the surface if someone walked through it. To capture that kind of height variation would require tons of geometry which 3D hardware in the 90s really could not possibly manage. So would it surprise you to learn that some of the best looking snow in the 90s didn't even use 3D accelerators at all? I personally think 1999's Outcast from Appeal and published by Infogrames is one of the best looking renditions of snow from the early era of 3D, and it doesn't even use a graphics accelerator. Everything you see here is running on the CPU, and in this case a moderately fast Pentium 3. By foregoing the use of 3D accelerators, the developers could end up utilizing techniques to render the snow and more that would only become commonplace years later, like bump mapping and depth of field. Here the ground of the game isn't rendered with triangles. Instead, the devs are ray-marching through a voxel field with some interpolation between it. So if you look at the floor inside of a building, you can see the floor has a rounded look between raised areas. Characters and other objects in the game are rendered in software on the CPU as polygons that are skinned or rigid bodies. The huge advantage of this game rendering stuff on the CPU is that it's unfettered from polygon density limits of the time that you'd have on a 3D accelerator. And the effect on snow is dramatic. The snow itself has tons of micro detail all over it. Areas of varying height and detail that are much denser than triangles from 3D accelerators could accomplish at this time at reasonable performance. The snow can also have each facet be individually lit, which in an era of vertex lighting looks a lot smoother than you'd find on a 3D accelerator. The most interesting property of the snow is how characters and objects moving through it produce these indentations in the snow that don't look purely 2D. Due to ray marching, your character, Cutter Slade, cuts little holes in the snow with each footstep. And if you look, they kind of look like they have a bit of 3D depth to them. Deforming large pieces of terrain in real time with triangles at this level of detail really would have been a nightmare on a 3D accelerator or even early GPU in 1999. When you combine this with the snow falling from the sky, the distance fog, and even camera depth of field in the distance to further increase atmosphere, Outcast in 1999 has technical features in its rendering of snowy landscapes that will only become more commonplace in GPU-rendered games a decade later. It's technically and artistically awesome due to not being limited to the constraints that 3D accelerators imposed at the time. The downside of this approach is that resolution and performance was low. CPU rendering is expensive, and a Pentium 3, which was top of the line in 1999, is barely cruising by at 30 FPS at 400 by 300, often falling below that 30 FPS line. In comparison, polygonal games at this time of release could easily run at 800 by 600 or higher, approaching 60 FPS on 3D accelerators like the TNT2 Pro. The limitations are obvious, but it is fascinating to see how this game, Outcast, was so ahead of the curve technically, just by virtue of sidestepping hardware acceleration. Moving beyond early 3D accelerators, hardware advancements of the early 2000s, such as this GeForce 3 here, reinvigorated the graphics industry. Whereas early 3D hardware was more about brute forcing enhancements gen on gen to get basics like triangles and textures rendering faster, DX8 and DX9 made GPUs, as they were now called, much more flexible. The programmability of pixel and vertex shaders kicked off a new wave of innovation for the effects GPUs could achieve beyond flat lighting and textures. These effects took snow to a whole new level. One of the best examples I can think of for this is in Halo Combat Evolved. Now, GPUs of this era still had a limited triangle budget, so they couldn't just throw more triangles at every problem to solve things. Instead now, developers could use pixel shaders to make 2D textures on the ground look much more true to life. With bump mapping and per pixel shading, even 2D flat texture planes in Halo Combat Evolved could be lent a whole new sense of depth just by how light spreads across the surface when the camera moves. Yep, we now have reflections. This added in the appearance of undulations and surface variation that wasn't even there, just due to the way light was reflecting off of the surface. With this power, snow looked better than ever before, and ice was particularly impressive looking in Halo Combat Evolved, having 2D cracks form on its surface with little triangular transparent geometry gliding across its surface as you slide a vehicle across it. And the ice also uses an environment map or cube map on its surface to give the impression of a very coherent reflection of your surroundings. The snow itself also could be lit in a per pixel manner now, making the light play across its surface in ways that are kind of reminiscent from Outcast from years earlier, although now running much faster and at much higher res thanks to GPU acceleration. Still, Halo was heavy at the time of release when resolution was high like I'm showing here. Using an FX 5900 XT at 1024 by 768 maxed out, the game really struggles in larger scenes. Sure, the FX series GPUs were not known as the best GPUs ever, but pixel shading is still expensive at this time, even in this kind of compromised Gearbox port of Halo CE from 2003. Another thing the early pixel shader era ramped up was in snowflake rendering. In Halo CE, I'd say they're kind of simple and more akin to stuff we saw in the 3D Accelerator era. But move over onto Hitman Contracts from 2004 and we see a whole new paradigm. Here, the game's icy Siberia level is one of the best representations of a blizzard from this time period. Like an Outcast in 1999, distant terrain is obscured by fog and even a pixel-shaded depth of field effect running on the GPU, which gives the game an appropriate whiteout look at the distance that just wasn't easily done on a graphics accelerator in the era before pixel shading. The star of the show, though, are those snowflakes, here represented by triangle strips that vary in length and size based upon the camera's position and their velocity. They stretch as they move, giving them an ultra-hectic, motion blur look, even though this game doesn't have motion blur as we would know of it years later. Between these fast-moving flakes and the blowing snow drifts, the gameplay space looks positively freezing here, and GPU advancements in pixel shading made it all possible. Now, before we move on to the modern era with that beautiful Overclockers UK PC, we need to talk about the era that primed our current one. And that era started with the 8800 GTX, a monster of a GPU that redefined what consumers could expect in generational upgrades. Programmability, flexibility, and shading power were dramatically increased on this GPU with complex DX9 or new DX10 titles, and developers would represent aspects of Snow that just were not possible before. In this era, one of the top titles I associate with Snow is Capcom's Lost Planet from late 2006. This was the second outing of the brand new MT Framework engine, and it was especially impressive on PC, which had multi-core support and DX10 exclusive effects utilizing that API's expansions. When it comes to snow rendering, some things are particularly well done here. When trudging through the snowdrifts, your character or mech kick up snow around them. Here, the developers spawn a billboard particle around your feet at the same time as spawning some bald geometry to look like snow has piled up in the shape of a footstep in your wake. Just some simple spawning and despawning of things, but it is incredibly effective, and unlike in past titles, it's not just a 2D decal there, like we saw in Supreme Snowboarding behind your snowboard. It's actually something with 3D depth. Like in past titles, the game then mixes in semi-transparent particles in the air of different sizes and density. There's also distance fog and a bit of depth of field that comes in from a DX10 exclusive effect. All of this in greater quantities and higher precision than early pixel shader era equivalents. On top of this, we see some high-level shading to make the snow and ice more tangible. In the PC version under DX10, all of your gunshots on the snow surface leave decals that use parallax mapping to look like you've shot 3D holes in the snow. Parallax mapping actually shares similarities to the ray marching we saw earlier in 1999 on the CPU in Outcast. But here the ray marching occurs within the confines of a texture, so at grazing angles you can actually see it's not fully 3D as it distorts incorrectly. But still, it's a great facsimile of the 3D look, and it is used in an even greater degree in the next title I will talk about. A last finishing touch by Capcom would be dynamic layering and shading changes. When the enemy Acrid perish, the shader on the body rapidly changes to another one, giving them a thick, icy blue look as if they've rapidly frozen in the cold. That is, of course, until you shatter them. And your character Wayne, when he moves in and out of snowy areas, his body gets caked with a 2D snow texture, which then slowly disappears when you enter a warmer area. It is subtle, but a wonderful little touch. Due to its reliant on mostly static lighting and somewhat lower poly models for its time period, Lost Planet is probably one of the best performing games I will showcase in this video when maxed out. In gameplay, it ran at an amazing 60 FPS in most scenes. Yes, I am using a top-tier 8800 GTX system in SLI here, but even that GPU combination could be humbled greatly if a game really shot for the stars. And if you know me, you probably already know what I'm going to talk about next. Crisis.
Maximum game.
Now, when many people think of Crisis, they think of an island jungle, but a little more than halfway through the game, the alien menace behind the conspiracy freezes the island, turning large parts of it into snow-blown icy wastes. The effect of a frozen tropical paradise is incredibly impressive for 2007, and I honestly think it looks a generation removed from its contemporaries, even with me just demonstrating it here at a wonky frame rate at 720p on that 8800 GTX SLI setup. One of the key drivers of the snowy terrain here looking so great is the game's extensive usage of parallax occlusion mapping and some high-level shading. The GPU power really still didn't exist to represent snow's extreme height variation with triangles, so like the terrain in Outcast in 1999 or the bullet holes in Lost Planet, ray marching in the game's textures here provides added 3D-like detail on the snowy terrain. Here it is even replete with pixel-perfect self-shadowing, which was very rare at the time. This detail in the textures is then combined with some dynamic layering. Remaking snowy versions of all the game's jungle assets was just not feasible for time, budget, and visual goals. So a number of the game's objects are the same as before, but they now have a dynamic layer shader applied to them, which gives them a frosty look. This applies to your hands, guns, characters, and many objects in the environment. And if you look closely, you may notice that there are little sparkles in there. In real life, when you look at frost or a snow surface, you can see it has tiny little fractals of details from the flakes and veins of ice, detail that is incredibly small. These microfacets catch glints of light and reflect it briefly into your eyes as you move, creating a glint effect. Such detail is much smaller than a pixel on a screen, and Crysis tries to emulate this glinting effect with an associated texture and a shader effect. This attention to surface shading detail extends to Crysis's expansion pack Warhead, where engineers concocted a very impressive thick ice shader. Once again, it appears to use ray marching to get that volume look, and it has the look of light scattering underneath the surface, where the thickness of the ice determines how dark or light it is. And if you pay attention, you can even see how shadows on the surface of the ice penetrate below the surface, leaving what one might call deep shadows visible below. The true icing on the proverbial cake in Crysis is just all the small tertiary details, like how sitting in a storm causes you and your visor to freeze over with an overlayered refraction effect, requiring you to physically move your character and mouse again for it to melt away. Or perhaps most impressive are the physicalized snow particles you can occasionally find. Simulated on the CPU, some snow particles will repel and bounce around the environment, giving the storm a new level of physicality. As we will see in our next title, physicalizing snow particle behavior and making it react to the forces around it is a key step in the push toward modern snow rendering we see in games today. The catch with Crysis being so advanced in any area that I just talked about here in 2007 comes down to performance. Here on very high with 4x MSAA at 720p, the 8800 GTX SLI rig I'm showing with a 3 GHz Core 2 quad spends most combat scenes between 30 and 40 FPS. The game ping-pongs between being CPU and GPU limited depending upon where you look. So I can say, even when below zero, Crysis has no chill. Cryostasis from Action Forms never really lit up the charts as a psychological horror game, but in late 2008 it became well known among PC enthusiasts for offering up a most punishing implementation of hardware-accelerated physics. These physics effects have a number of incredible firsts. With particles running on the GPU, metric tons of them could be spawned to represent different aspects of icy weather. You have the snowflakes themselves, where you can see how snow will drift and careen around objects flowing with the wind. Indoor areas with ice and icicles break apart into thousands of translucent and refractive shards that can be pushed along the ground. And perhaps most impressively, when you turn on a heat source in the boat's ice-filled rooms, the ice begins to thaw into meltwater, causing shading changes on the wall to look like cascading water, and physicalized snowdrip with little particles attached to a fluid simulation. This phase change effect from ice into flowing water using particles was shockingly new in 2008 and has barely been represented in games since then. The hardware required to show flowing water like this was obscenely high in 2008, and surely you've noticed the less than stellar performance here when the particles are on screen. On that 8800 GTX SLI rig, the game spends a lot of time with unstable performance between 30 and 40 FPS when particles are spawned, and it can even drop into the 20s at its worst. The game is incredibly demanding, but it does have groundbreaking snow and ice rendering and some interactions that are still barely found in modern games today. The The last bridge to the modern day comes from finally being able to represent snow's surface details and all that height variation with real geometry or triangles. As we've seen in this video, geometry performance has always been one of the big blockers on the way to realism in snow rendering. Devs resorted to different texture tricks over time, like bump maps or parallax maps, to try and get halfway there. In 2013 with Batman Arkham Origins, I would say the gap was bridged between past and present by allowing the user to render the snow like it's been done in the past and how it would be done in nearly all games in the future. On consoles and without a certain DX11 effect enabled, this is how Batman Arkham Origins handles snow. It essentially has dynamic parallax maps. As we can see here, walking through the snow creates big areas in the snow texture surface that appear to have depth, as if Batman cleared the way through it. It's pretty awesome, but it has its limitations, like we talked about earlier. If you walk around a deformed surface at all, it can look odd, as the detail will morph and lose its depth at grazing angles. It's basically a flat texture with a perspective trick. If you turn on DX11 tessellation, that dynamic deformation is now represented with real geometry, being dynamically subdivided on the GPU. With GPU tessellation, graphics cards finally had enough geometry performance to capture nuanced height variations on snow's surface. Let's compare the past and the present directly. When looking from above, parallax map and tessellation look similar enough, but when viewed closer, we can see how much more detail is on the tessellation on the right, where the parallax texture tricks on the left look comparatively flat. The tessellation on the right has silhouettes that can clear the texture surface, and these add a lot of greater detail that we just don't see on the left. If we compare the deformation fidelity, we can also see that when Batman walks through the snow, we can see how the previous technique cannot show the depth variety between steps. It almost looks like Batman plowed through the snow with a freight train. With tessellation, we can see how each foot indent, left and right, is now visible, and those footprints are noticeably deeper than the areas between the steps where Batman really only grazed the snow there. Batman Arkham Origin had a lot of ultra high-end effects in it, like GPU smoke simulations and tons of GPU snow particles, kind of like we saw in cryostasis, but its most enduring technical legacy is probably its snow deformation, I would argue. In the intervening period between this game and the present day, GPU tessellated snow became the de facto way to render it. And with that being said, we've actually explored the last large historical technical advancement in snow rendering that brings us up to the modern day. To highlight the advances in modern day snow rendering, I'll be grabbing footage of the games on the aforementioned Overclockers UK PC, kindly provided for this video, which has been a real joy to use and just look at. If you're interested in any aspect of the system, be it color, form, or specs, I definitely recommend checking out the links below in the description. While playing the modern games on this PC, I really wanted a GPU to match the snowy theme, so I specifically chose the Inno3D GeForce RTX 5070 Twin X2OC. It is a compact and space-conscious RTX GPU that will seamlessly fit into much smaller form factor builds than the one I'm showcasing in this video. While I of course appreciate this contemporary white aesthetic and compact size, I was also pleased with its performance, which kept up to pace at higher resolutions that I required for this video, partially in thanks to upgraded boost clocks over the standard model. So thanks to Inno3D for supplying this card. Now on to those modern games. The biggest changes to snow since 2013's Batman Arkham Origins are found in the fidelity, shading, and lighting, while the physicalization of snow, like its deformation, has actually largely remained similar. A great example of what I mean can be found in Red Dead Redemption 2, a game whose opening chapter in the snow wowed people at release on PC in 2019. Here I'm running the game at 4K native, targeting 60 FPS, and I think at that resolution and frame rate, we can greatly appreciate how much better this game's snow looks than those I've previously shown. But if you actually break down the effects types, they're mostly the same or similar to ones that we've already highlighted in historical games in this video. When characters are in the snow for a while, they have a caked snow texture layer applied to them that disappears in warmer areas, just like I showed from Lost Planet. The blizzard-like conditions at a distance we see in the intro are made to look the way they are by combining fog, depth of field, and some very fast-moving particles close to the screen, kind of like we saw in Hitman Contracts. And if you look up close at snow, you can see that they add extra detail into the snow surface via normal maps, which is just the successor of bump mapping like I described in Halo Combat Evolved. Like I detailed in Crisis, we also see tiny glint reflections on the snow's surface, and when objects move through the snow, GPU-based tessellation deforms the snow at the place of contact, much like we saw in Batman Arkham Origins. These are the same core concepts and techniques, but the totality of all these effects being together in one game now, combined with the granularity of detail and physically based materials, well, the snow just looks that much more tactile and real in this game than it did in the past. Fog, for example, is not just a clip plane distance fog like we would see in games from the 90s, but it's actually volumetric, with light and shadow play dashing through it in a dramatic fashion. The snow itself also now has physically based reflection properties, unlike the mono materials we would see in the past, and the particles we see flying around us now actually accept local lighting, unlike the more basically shaded ones of years gone by. And that ground deformation, it for sure uses more triangles than what we saw in Batman. All of these enhancements pile up to make Red Dead Redemption 2 look a lot better than the historical titles we talked about, even though it is technically using a lot of the same techniques under the hood. This is a game from 2019 though, and I would say a number of games since then have further surpassed it. Looking at Assassin's Creed Shadows running in 4K DLSS performance mode maxed out, there are a number of advancements over Red Dead's snow rendering, but there are two standout ones for me. The snowflakes themselves have a huge amount of volume in them, and physicality, with thousands of them blowing around the scene in any one moment in a storm. As if taking a cue from our friend Cryostasis from 2008, the developers hooked up the particles to a fluid wind simulation which pushes them around the scene and across and around objects in the landscape. The particles also stretch in length depending upon their speed and the camera orientation, giving them an ultra-fast motion blurred look that is somewhat reminiscent of what we saw in Hitman Contracts. Beyond the particles, another advancement in snow rendering would be the granularity of the tessellation on the ground when you walk through it. It has for sure been ratcheted up a notch. Here, the compacted areas adhere much closer to the body's actual movements and location, and the edges around the areas compacted now show much more geometric variation, as if the snow has now been pushed out of the way. Truly though, I would say one of the greatest heights in modern snow rendering can be found in a brief section of Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. And would it surprise you if I told you that this is the most GPU resource hungry game on this list by far? Here I'm going to run the game at 1440p DLSS balance mode, as I've ticked all of the full ray tracing options to maxed, which essentially gives us path trace lighting on the snow, and although this is only lighting, in air quotes there, the effect of lighting on snow is actually monumental, as it can drive those physically based materials we have these days much more accurately, increasing the variety of how snow can look. Take outside on the mountaintop. Here the snow looks extremely powdery and diffuse, as the lighting on it is this massive, omnidirectional big white sky, which has light coming from all directions. This essentially eliminates shadow detail and any evidence of directional light, giving the snow a powdery look. But if you go indoors with a cave with few openings, you have more directional lighting. So now the snow looks highly reflective, picking up sharp highlights on its edges in the direction of the light, while then having deep pockets of shadow in the recessed regions. Such strong directional lighting with tight shadows allows us to appreciate how Indiana Jones probably has the densest geometric snow deformation to date, where at this point we assuredly have to be talking about triangles that are approaching pixel sized, I can imagine. Compare the density of this tessellation to that found in Red Dead 2, and I think you can see what I mean. In less than half of a decade, we've greatly increased the geometric density of how we represent snow, and this aids its appearance on top of its more accurate lighting. One of my favorite details in Indiana Jones is how the ice looks now. Unsurprisingly, accurate bounce lighting via path tracing is pretty important for something that is translucent yet highly reflective, and I think the images here speak for themselves. With Indiana Jones, I think my point about modern games is well demonstrated. It is using the same core ideas about how to render snow as games of the past, but we now have markedly increased deformation, much denser particles, much better shading, and our lighting detail is approaching offline rendering to a degree. And with that, we can have snow that at a glance can pass the squinting test almost and actually fool you into thinking that, hey, maybe this is the real deal. And importantly, nowadays, unlike all the other stuff I showed in this video to this point, state-of-the-art snow rendering is much more performant. These modern games that I was showing here were easily hitting 60 FPS and much higher at high resolutions while looking as good as they did. For games of yesteryear, that more often than not was not the case, even on the best hardware available. But just as snow melts in the spring, this video must come to an end. I hope you enjoyed my romp through the snowy plains of computing's past, and if you did, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, ring that little bell, support on Patreon, follow on Blue Sky, and as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und frohe Feiertage.
Let's get the ugly bastards a taste of their own. You with me, son? Hell yeah!